Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. This is part 5 of bashing and thrashing the Declaration of Independence. Today we're going to look at Englishman John Lind's attack and criticism of this particular grievance in the Declaration of Independence, where it says, he, that is King George III, has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant, in other words, far away from the depository of their public records, in other words, from where they normally meet, where they're supposed to meet. And for what purpose does the king make them meet at these other unusual, uncomfortable, and distant places? For the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. Okay, before we get to an analysis of that particular grievance from the perspective of John Lind, here's something to think about. Did Thomas Jefferson write those words? Maybe he did, and maybe he didn't. Historians tell us that it was probably the contribution of John Adams, because of a slip of paper and handwriting of John Adams with that particular phraseology. But whether it was Thomas Jefferson or John Adams, who was actually one of the 5 from the Committee of 5, which was responsible for drafting the Declaration of Independence, whether it was Thomas Jefferson, who is primarily credited with the writing of the Declaration of Independence, or John Adams, really, ultimately, at the end of the day, doesn't matter. And this is the reason why it doesn't matter, because they all signed the document saying they agree with the accusation of King George III that he was moving the meetings from the local colonies or local legislative bodies from their normal regular meeting places into different places that were unusual, uncomfortable, and distant. Now, you may have never even thought of this particular grievance in the Declaration of Independence. And the founders tied it to a strategy designed to fatigue them into giving in to whatever the king wanted. Now, you ever met somebody who just continues to talk and talk, and they just try to wear you down until you just get so tired, you just agree and say, fine, 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 you're right, you're right. Well, this was perhaps something like that. But the question is, what did the founders mean? Unusual, uncomfortable, and distant? Certainly, that's not something that is really covered in classrooms, unless it's an AP or an advanced level class, because there are other more big theme issues that schools only have time for. So the rest of this video, we're going to be spending some time on just this particular grievance. And we know that John Lind addressed this grievance in his response to the American Declaration of Independence. And we're going to look at that a little bit more closely now. We're going to look briefly at his response. And John Lind immediately sets out to sort of laugh. His first reaction is to just laugh at that. He can't believe it's even in the Declaration. Let's take a deep dive.
It's time for another episode of the History Behind the Headline.
John Lind says, there is something so truly ridiculous in this argument that it is hardly possible to answer it with any seriousness. At first blush, it looks as if these words were inserted by an enemy who intended to throw an air of ridicule on the Declaration in general. You get that? In other words, it almost sounds so comical that the whole purpose kind of defeats the rest of the tone of the Declaration, which he also doesn't believe is anything but falsehood. But this particular portion, he says, it's so absurd. It looks like it was put in there by an enemy who wants to make the rest of the document look completely foolish. He also said, among the reasons to justify a national revolt, we find it gravely or seriously allege that the members of a colonial assembly happened once upon a time to be straitened in their apartments and compelled to sit on strange seats and to sleep in strange beds. So the mockery is clear. The reason we're having this national revolt, this rebellion among the 13 colonies, is because these individuals are being inconvenienced. He goes on, I believe this complaint is unparalleled in the history of mankind. Now think about that. From your world history, ancient history, Greece, Athens, Rome, uh, Europe, Africa, Latin America, he is saying that this complaint is unparalleled in the history of mankind. He immediately sets out to minimize it as being further evidence that these complaints, these complaining colonists, are really not worthy of that serious attention. Our Declaration of Independence. He says, sickly and feeble must be the makeup of that patriotism if these hardships, dreadful as they are, could fatigue them into compliance with unpatriotic measures. Now, this, of course, is not just sarcasm, but it's a little bit of sophistry here, because obviously he's trying to deliver a death blow when he says that, really, this is how patriotic your cause is, that you can be fatigued into giving it up. So now he's even questioning the sincerity of their words. Okay, let me interrupt John Lind here just to add some brief historical context. Now, historians tell us that Thomas Jefferson and the founders intentionally left out dates, events, and times for the grievances that they cite. And that's why we don't know specifically which events and meetings are being referred to, although we can figure that out with a little bit of research. Now, the reason those were intentionally left out is because that's not the purpose of the Declaration. Thomas Jefferson and the founders were not trying to write an academic paper. You know, those with the footnotes where you cite your research and give your evidence and cite your sources. No, that's not the purpose. The purpose of the Declaration is stated within the Declaration. They tell us, let these facts be submitted to a candid world. The 13 colonies wanted to justify their reasons for declaring independence, and the document lays out their reasons as facts to be submitted to a candid world. And the second purpose of the Declaration, of course, was to persuade other patriots to join the cause. So Thomas Jefferson knew that his readers would understand which events were being referred to when he wrote the Declaration. So then John Lind gives us a historical clue as to which meeting or meetings are being referred to in the Declaration of Independence by the founders that was serious enough to be listed among the grievances in the Declaration. John Lind writes, for these reasons as well, say the instructions to the governor to obviate any objection on account of the troops as to show a proper resentment of the behavior of the inhabitants of Boston, it was thought expedient that the governor should meet the general court at Cambridge. In other words, for the reasons he laid out, mob rule, the instructions that were given to the British-backed governor was, hey, to avoid any issue with these troops, because they were aware the colonists didn't like it. There was skirmishes. There was fiction. We know this. Why don't you meet somewhere else? Now, where precisely would that be? First, let's look at this image from Google Maps for some perspective. You can see clearly where Boston is located, which is the regular location for the meetings held by the Massachusetts Assembly. And then you see Cambridge, roughly 4 miles away. It'd take you a little over an hour to get there by foot. But Lind, to buttress his argument, adds these words, and he says that it was still left to the governor's discretion not to meet the assembly at Cambridge if the governor should think that that was probably the wisest course of action. according to the instructions, if there were reasons to the contrary of such a nature to outweigh the considerations of mob rule and troops and so forth. So, in other words, he was saying this wasn't forced on the governor, this was up to the governor ultimately. Lynn wraps up his point by saying, see then to what this mighty charge amounts. His Majesty King George III, desirous on the one hand that the presence of his troops doesn't give the impression that they're there to restrain public debate, and on the other hand that the ungovernable mob should not actually restrain the freedom of debate, the freedom of speech. So the king, concerned and sensitive, concerned about public safety, concerned about the concerns of his subjects, instructed his governor to meet the general court at a place where both of these objections would cease. You take care of the social chaos, the disorder, and also you address the issue of the concerns about the being surrounded by troops as if they were there to intimidate, to meet at a place where both of these objections would end. And that place would have been Harvard College. Harvard College in 1776. So Thomas Hutchinson, who was a former governor of Massachusetts, actually weighed in on this particular grievance of the in the Declaration. And although these aren't words that John Lind uses, and the focus of this series is just John Lind, I wanted to throw what Thomas says here because I thought it would be interesting, because look what he says about this particular place. He says, the public rooms at the college were convenient for the assembly to sit in, and the private houses of the inhabitants for the members to lodge in. It therefore was not uncomfortable, lifting that word straight out of the Declaration. It was within 4 miles of the town of Boston and less distant, again, lifting that word from the Declaration, distant than any other town fit for the purpose of having a meeting that was relocated. Furthermore, he also says in this long response, he goes on to say that it was also not unusual because earlier there was a concern about a smallpox outbreak, and the assembly relocated at that time for fear of smallpox. So not unusual, not uncomfortable, and not as distant. So again, the Declaration doesn't really identify what specific meetings are being referred to. Could this have been it? And if it was, are we to then conclude that the founders were just a bunch of wimps that they couldn't handle relocating to a college 4 miles away? Is that what really? That's certainly the argument that the pro King George faction proposed in 1776. So we have to dig a little bit deeper and look at some of the research presented by historians on what was possibly being referred to in the Declaration. So I want to say, and wrapping this up, just 3 things in response to John Lind. The first thing that we want to look at is what historians say the Declaration of Independence was referring to when, as you see in the quote, they were talking about moving meetings. The first thing historians tell us is that this does in fact refer to the removal of the Massachusetts Assembly from Boston to Cambridge from 1769 to 1772, about 3 years. The first time that this was done was due to the legislatures objecting to holding sessions while being surrounded by troops. And the second time was a result of the disturbances related to the Stamp Act. And of course, we know that Lind doesn't provide any historical context. He just says there's mob rule, but he doesn't specifically tie it to the Stamp Act. The second thing I want to say is that that really doesn't explain the unusual, uncomfortable, distant reference in the grievance, right? Harvard College, probably very comfortable. So historians tell us that that probably had something to do with the time Thomas Jefferson was a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1775, when Lord Dunmore, the governor of the colony of Virginia, quote, took refuge on a warship named the Fowey and extended an invitation for the legislature to meet him there. So he was basically escaping this mob rule And he actually took his 12 children, and they were hiding in this Royal Navy ship. So, and if you research the history of that ship, which is actually rather interesting, you could see where it would probably be unusual, uncomfortable, and certainly distant. However, even that doesn't really address what the intent and the meaning of the declaration is trying to convey here. So for that, we turn to historian John R. Vile, who said that these responses failed to grasp the way in which Massachusetts had regarded the removal of its legislature as an improper exercise of the governmental prerogative that also threatened other liberties. So they were missing the point. They were not understanding the extent to which the perception among the colonists was that this simple act of relocating a meeting was in fact a real threat to their liberty. That's what they missed in their attack, and they're not taking it seriously. Clearly, the colonists believed that it really was, and they were willing to go to arms and fight for independence as a result. But this reality seemed to be something that was denied or just not really grasped by those who tried to defend King George III at this time. And John Lind doesn't really say much beyond what I've quoted, and he certainly doesn't address the real heartfelt issue about the threat upon liberty that this act of moving the meeting, and particularly when you consider that the Declaration sometimes lists grievances that may have referred to one or two colonies or a bunch of colonies. It doesn't really say. Again, that's intentional. However, if you think about it, you think long and hard about it, you can see now you've got friction with this empire. The British Navy is the envy of the world. You're putting meetings in the Royal Navy, and what does that imply? What is the symbolism that's there to the legislatures? That a very visual image of who's in charge here. So if you're sort of, even though Lynn tries to make it seem as if the king was very sensitive to the concerns at the time, and even if we give him the benefit of the doubt, he was still not as sensitive as he needed to be because of his management of the 13 colonies, which we know in retrospect what was going on was just that, a mismanagement of the 13 colonies. That's all I have for now. So thank you for watching. And if you'd like to know more, be sure to read the notes that I left in the description with some links for additional information. Also, feel free to comment. I do want to know what you think, any thoughts that you might have. I'm looking forward to learning from you as well. And if you have some questions, go ahead and leave it there. And also, I'll have a new video soon. In the meantime, if you want to make your life more pleasurable, feel free to hit the subscribe button. And remember, the past is never dead. It isn't even past.